Ladies and gentlemen, good morning if you're joining us from Europe, and good afternoon if you are watching this webinar from the Asia Pacific region. My name is Olivier Ponti. I am VP for Insights at ForwardKeys, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this first edition of ForwardKeys and Friends. ForwardKeys and Friends is a series of webinars when we invite industry friends to discuss the latest trends and the future of tourism, aviation, and the travel industry in general, with a strong emphasis on how to make an efficient use of data. Today, we will focus on a research paper that has been recently published by Javier Font from the University of Surrey and Inma Gallego from the University of Malaga. And in this research paper, the researchers investigated how big data could be used by DMOs, tourism boards, and governments to make better decisions. Javier, please switch on your camera so that our audience can see you. We're delighted to have you with us today. You are Professor of Sustainable Marketing at the University of Surrey. You also know DMOs inside out because you've worked with a number of them in the past years, helping them transition to a more sustainable way of doing business. Once more, it's really a pleasure for us having you here, and we're delighted that you accepted our invitation.
It's a pleasure, and we're very happy that we're able to get access to your database to do this analysis.
Great. Let's move on to the next slide, if we can. Javier, could you please move on to the next slide? Thank you. So before we start, I'd like to remind to the next slide as well. Thank you. I'd like to remind the audience that your research paper is available for a limited period of time and free of charge on the internet. So I would strongly suggest that you download this document right after the end of this webinar. A few housekeeping remarks before we kick off. This session is being recorded, and we will send all participants the recording and the PowerPoint via email. And at the end of this session, we will have a question and answer session. Feel free to ask questions at any moment during the webinar. You're all muted, but you can start typing your question by using the menu, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. Just push the question button. That's the one with the question mark on it. Easy to find. So without further ado, Javier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivier. What we'll do is we'll close our video cameras. This way you have a better view of the screen and you get to see some of the graphs that we want to show you today. So essentially what we've done with this study is analyze data on flights and how many flights there have been and who is trying to fly at the moment during this period of COVID. We wanted to understand the impact that COVID has in our tourism destinations. We wanted to understand how tourist destinations were going to develop and what is the evolution that a particular destination can have compared to some of their competitors. And we wanted to understand in particular when markets were going to reactivate, but not only that, but which markets are more likely to reactivate first. We're aware that not every market is going to reactivate at the same speed. To do this, we've been doing an analysis of data, and we have realized that traditional statistics are not particularly helpful when it comes to analyzing the current situation, because traditional statistics are looking back in time, and that doesn't really tell us an awful lot about where we want to be. And therefore, we've seen the benefit of being able to use big data, and we've been very happy to work with ForwardKeys in getting access to this big data. The objective, therefore, of working with the ForwardKeys data set was that we were able to look at the early detection of reactivation of these tourist markets. we had access to the database provided by ForwardKeys. There's a number of databases that ForwardKeys provides in their platform, and the one we used was data from Skyscanner. So we selected the most appropriate variables within that. We extracted the data. Actually, ForwardKeys makes that relatively straightforward at this point in time. And from this, we're able to look at and design indicators of early detection of how different markets are reactivating, or the likelihood of reactivation in the next few months. And we've been able to write the results and make them available to you free of charge. What we've done, therefore, is we've searched data from Skyscanner. This was a substantial amount of data Skyscanner provides us. The data we've been working with and we're sharing with you today is the result of 5,000 million flight searches, basically taking place between November 2018 and April 2020. And these were flight searches that were going up to the end of 2020. So people searching ahead of time to be able to fly over the 12 months basically from the moment of looking for their flight search. And we've been looking at desire to travel as well as intention to travel. It's important to understand the difference between those two. Clearly, desire to travel and intention to travel are two steps before taking a decision to travel, the actual purchase. The data that Skyscanner allows us to access is both desire to travel, essentially how people are searching online for a particular flight, and which are the destinations they're searching for. And then within the destinations that appear and the different flights that appear within that choice, we then get to see how people pick essentially some specific routes. And the material that Skyscanner provides us doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't allow us to see whether somebody, after picking a particular route, they'll go through to actually making a purchase or not, because there's a limitation to what the data allows. Clearly, desire to travel is much more generic. Many more people are right now searching will I be able to travel again by Christmas 2020, for example, whereas intention to travel is one step further. Once you've given them a range of choices, are people actually clicking saying, oh, the particular flight I like, with the price I like, with the route I like, on the time of day that I like, is this one. I'll click on it to get more details. So you can see intention to travel is clearly one step ahead from where we were before. Let me just share some data. And in the journal article that we've shared with you for free, there is much more data. This is just to show you the variety of data sets that we've got. We did our last analysis of this data for this particular journal article on the 30th of April 2020. And on that particular day, we could see that the flight, basically how people have been searching for flights and how they've been picking those flights, essentially, so desire to fly and intention to fly. Typically, searches are higher in volume than number of picks. There's a much bigger difference at the beginning of the year. So you can see, for example, November 2019, excuse me. So when it comes to, for example, searches for flights in Northeast Asia, that will include China, South Korea, Japan, it's almost gone up by 80% compared to the previous year, which means that over the 12 months before 2019, more than almost 80% more flight searches than in the previous year, and to be able to fly for that 2019. And therefore, we're coming from a situation where there was a massive latent demand, increased desire to fly. Obviously, then the number of picks is 20%, so people have been searching a lot more, whereas the gap, for example, in Europe is lower. But in both cases, you can see year on year substantial increases in the number of searches and picks. We can see that the drop in searches and picks in Northeast Asia happened much more quickly, as we could expect, January, but then very sharply already in February, whereas the drop in February in Europe, in Southern Europe, including Italy and Spain, both highly affected destinations by COVID, didn't happen as quickly. And you can see that the Northeast Asia market, at the moment when we did this analysis at April 2020, look less likely to recover by the end of the year, whereas in Southern Europe, there was a desire to fly towards Southern Europe and fly in Europe towards the end of the year. You can see the number of searches is recovering to almost what would have been a year earlier. However, the number of picks and therefore people's kind of willingness to commit to a particular flight is not recovering as much. So the data we've got at this point in time, as of 30th of April, looks like we're not recovering on a V-shaped form or even a U-shaped form, but actually this looks more like an L-shape process of change. As we move forward in time, and as we look at how we have done this analysis at different points in time, we can see that the moment when we do the analysis does vary the results. So we had done initial analysis on the 7th of April, and then we did again on the 30th of April, and you can see a substantial difference. So the lines are parallel, more or less, okay? The fact that there's a greater recovery, for example, in October 2020 than in November 2020 for Europe, and the same for Northeast Asia is clear, and that hasn't changed so much. But what is changing is the percentage of people are looking for flights at a particular point in time, okay? And the more the time passes, the more pronounced the kind of a reduction in number of people looking for flights for the next few months is. So obviously you can see that everything that's happened up to April 2020 is actual flights that already have taken place, whereas what happened from April 2020 onwards is, essentially flights that people have been searching in the months up to April 2020 to be able to fly in the near future. These are real searches, these are forecasts based on searches, but these are real searches that have happened. We haven't gone and surveyed somebody with a questionnaire and said, will you want to fly or not, where there is a substantial chances for social desirability. This is what you've actually done on the internet yourselves. If we compare Europe and Asia more broadly, you can see that in some destinations in Northern Europe, there is a greater propensity to recover towards the end of the year. So for example, the Northern European market and the Western European market being more resilient towards this and being willing to start flying sooner than, for example, the Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Southern European markets. And we can see that, for example, in China, there is a low propensity to recover, but different markets again behave differently. For example, Middle East is more likely to recover faster than Northeast Asia would have been, or South Asia. Okay, and the advantage of these more granular amount of data, and we could go much further obviously in our analysis, gives you a picture of, well, which will be the parts of the world that are more likely to recover. The material is in ForwardKeys would allow you to do this analysis not only per subcontinent, but you can do them per country, and you can do them for particular airports. So you could find out, for example, are people searching to fly from smaller airports compared to larger airports? Are people trying to avoid large airports because they're more concerned about crowdedness at the airport as opposed to on the airplane, and so on? So there's a variety of searches that you can do with this data. We then try to drill down some of this data and focus on one particular country to be able to see, well, what would happen in terms of the value and the validity of some of the data at country level. So we prepared a dashboard, in this case, comparing global changes over time for flights for summer, as opposed to for flights for autumn to December, to see whether markets were more likely to reactivate in the short term or towards the medium term. And you can see that no markets are reactivating in the short term. We classed in red any kind of drops in searches or picks are more than 30% compared to the previous year. We put in yellow searches that were between 0% and 30% drop from previous year, and we put in green searches that were above the average for the previous year. And using a traffic light format we thought was helpful because this is very visual and everybody can understand it. And what we could also see by doing it this way is that some markets were actually reactivating first. So for example, for the case of Spain, we can see that the United Kingdom and the Ireland market, for example, the searches to looking for flights for October to December are higher for searches for going to Spain than they are for searches globally from those two markets. So there's not only a desire from the UK, for example, to start, searching for flights higher than normal, but also Spain is one of their preferred destinations when it comes to that. So if you were the Spanish Tourist Board and you were using this data as of 30th of April, you would be considering, if you want to do some targeted marketing, to then do it in the UK. And then you'd go to the ForwardKeys data set and then say, right, which are the specific airports from the UK and to which specific airports in Spain where these searches happening now to be able to fly by October to December are higher than average, and therefore we can have a much more targeted marketing campaign to promote these particular routes for flights. All of this shows us the many advantages of big data. It shows us that this data is available in real time, that it gives us an amazing temporal as well as territorial granularity, as well as the fact that we can do forecasts based on real data, not on collecting questionnaires from potential tourists. There is always a time delay in trying to ask people, what is it that you may be willing to do? And I know you've got the advantage, you can ask further data when you do a questionnaire like that, but the time it takes to collect the data, to commission it, and the cost as well of collecting that kind of data, I think is fairly high compared to some of the advantages that big data provides you. I have to admit there are also some challenges in using big data, and a lot of the challenges can be overcome with good training, particularly around data scientists. One of the problems with big data is the sources are very fragmented. So if you got access to data, for example, from one particular mobile phone provider, and then next year you switch to a different mobile phone provider to see how they compare, you're not going to get the data in a way that is, that can basically, you can link the two different data sets. There's a challenge that a lot of this data requires to have much more user-oriented thinking, and many of the traditional statistics we've been collected have not really had the user in mind when we're looked at how we collect data. We have a challenge in making sure that official statistical agencies access the data and understand how to do a hybrid between the data sets that we've got so far, collecting the traditional ways, with the new data sets that are coming in through big data. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing from DMOs is that these new big data sets are being used in a more experimental way, but they're not really being incorporated and taken as seriously for taking decisions. And as I was saying earlier on, all of this can be overcome with good, thorough training of data scientists in these different tourist routes. And that's something that we're not seeing at the moment. This database, for example, gives you so much data. The challenge is not having data, but understanding what the data tells you and what you can do with some of that data. The journal article is available for you to download. If you go to Google, or particularly Google Scholar, and you search in Google Scholar for the title, Changes in Air Passenger Demand as a Result of COVID-19 Crisis, you will find the article. You'll be able to download it for free, and feel free to share the article or the link to the article. We produce this so more people like yourselves could then see what data exists. As we have already said, the data is up to date to the 30th of April, and we're hoping that we'll be able to continue analyzing this data set to be able to show you how data has changed. There's further data in the article that looks at the Americas continent. Remember, of course, 30th of April, COVID in the United States and South America looked very different to what we've got right now. So that's all for now. I just wanted to thank you for your time so far, and I believe that Olivier will now come back and open the floor for some questions.
Thank you very much, Javier, for this insightful presentation. While we leave a few minutes to our audience so that they can start writing down their question, I'd just like to remind our audience that you use two key data sets for this analysis: seating capacity for the global context and flight search for the core analysis, I would say. So in case you have any question regarding the use of these data sets and what you can do with them, please do not hesitate to reach out to us using the email address below, webinar@forwardkeys.com. This said, I think we can start to address some of the key questions being asked by our audience, and I will kick off with a question regarding how DMOs, which are currently using big data in a very limited way. You mentioned the word experimental. It's still very light, sometimes even non-existent, the way people within DMOs make use of big data. Why and how should they get started, according to you? What's your expert opinion on this?
I am not a data scientist working inside the DMO, so I, eventually will need to kind of confirm some of my opinions based on what we talk to them. But my first concern is that those DMOs have got a long-standing process for collecting data, and they are favoring the consistency of collecting data in the same way that they've always done it, so you can have a comparison over time over some of the benefits that new forms of data will provide you. Collecting that in the way that they've always done it as well is within their control. They've always done the same questionnaires, they've invested that, they've got an infrastructure to collect data and analyze the data that is within their control and within their budget. Whereas the moment that they're looking at opportunities for big data that are being provided by the third party, they feel they've got less control, they feel like somebody else is able to make changes to what the data will look like, and you're relying on that third party, and therefore that carries some risk.
Do you think the COVID crisis we're going through at the moment could act as an accelerator on this respect?
I think it's essential that we use more creative forms of data right now, because the weakness of using surveys that you conduct to your tourists when you come to your particular destination is that essentially you only get to know the people that came. You don't get to know why people are searching to come to your place, but then they never came. And equally, right now, who's come and why they've come and how they've come is so different to a year ago. You can't use data from a year ago to make decisions on what you're going to do next. Using past data right now to take decisions is a little bit like driving a car by only using the rear view mirror, but not being able to look at the road ahead. You would be able to drive very, very slowly if you could only use a rear view mirror. Big data allows you to look ahead.
Your field of expertise, Xavier, is big data analysis, but it's also sustainability. How can you link those two, big data and sustainability? I mean, right now it's the moment for many DMOs to pause and start thinking about the way forward, what they want for their destination in the future. And sustainability is something that has to be taken into account. How can big data help in this process?
Well, I think one thing we've realized now is that the two indicators we've always used of tourism, which is volume of tourists and expenditure per tourist, either per tourist per day or overall expenditure of tourism, are insufficient to be able to take informed decisions as a policymaker. Okay. One of the good things, there are very few things, but one of the good things about COVID has been that we have come back to putting the resident at the center of the reason why we have tourism. Right? And thinking that we want tourism so local people in a tourist destination can make a living. And also we've come back to putting the domestic tourist at the center of the decision making and saying we should look after our national tourists first. And the fact that our national tourists probably spend less per person per day is maybe less important right now than the fact that those are the tourists that in a situation of risk, we can actually go back and rely on. Now, my concern is that unless we use new forms of data, and big data can really help us with this, to be able to understand movement of passengers, expenditures, but also, for example, where people are spending their money and how much of that money is actually permeating into the local economy, we will not be able to take informed decisions. And the traditional statistics that I have seen from DMOs do not allow us to do that. They only tell us overall expenditure per person per night, for example, but they don't tell us where and how that money is being spent. Or they're not answering some of the questions that DMOs really need answers to, which is how do I reduce my seasonality, but also in a much more short term, how do I get myself out of this mess and how do I create some meaningful demand for tourism in my location?
Okay, thank you, Javier. We have a question from the audience, which I will read. In order to conduct a research based on big data, what of the challenges is the cost of this data? How can you reduce this problem? Do you have any example?
Okay, so thank you very much. The data we collected was with my co-author, who is not only an academic at the University of Malaga, but also she she's the data scientist essentially for Turismo de Andalucía, the Andalusia Tourism Board, the DMO. And Andalusia, although it's a region, I think somebody's got the microphone on. Okay, so on board.
In the
For
audience,
one
could
of
you please mute?
it actually receives more tourists than Thailand, for example, as a country. So they've got the budget to be able to collect data, and they do spend a significant amount of money on the ForwardKeys database. As academics, we access the database that we had access through that particular DMO. The question I would say is, if you're a DMO and you're investing money on data, it looks expensive, but I would say it's much more expensive to take policy decisions based on inaccurate data or outdated data. If you're an academic and you're doing data analysis and you're wanting to access big data, I understand that the cost is prohibitive, and I would recommend that you talk directly to some of the data providers to see if they have kind of a more affordable price for academics. Because ultimately, research like the one we have just done now, kind of shows the value of data and therefore makes your research better, but also it helps the data provider to, to showcase the validity of their work.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, excellent. You work with students every day, and one of the things that come out of your research paper is that there is a need for people properly trained to analyze big data. Is this the job of the future?
Oh, absolutely.
In the tourism sector?
Data scientists are very well paid and they're massively on demand. We need people with a quantitative data analysis to be able to analyze large data sets. What we also need is training for the data scientists to be able to analyze the data, but equally important, we need training for policymakers to know how to take evidence-based policy decisions. And one of my concerns, long-term concern, has been that a lot of the policy decisions we take are not sufficiently informed by evidence. I realize that statistical evidence is not going to be the only data that you use for taking policy decisions, but surely, the data that you have has to be one of the multiple elements used for taking data decisions. And what we have seen all too often is that policymakers take decisions for inertia, habit, simply because it politically is more appealing to do that. But there are many, many of the decisions that we see taken by policymakers that I question whether a test of effectiveness or efficiency behind those decisions has been made. I'm not just necessarily looking at a traditional kind of a return on investment, check or an evaluation of the project. But I see, clearly some DMOs are very switched on when it comes to, doing those evaluations. But I see many others that clearly are not, based on some of the strategies being put forward.
Thank you very much, Xavier. We've come to the end of this webinar. Time flies when you have fun. I hope it's been insightful for our audience. It has certainly been insightful for me. Once more, thank you, and thanks to your colleague Inma Gallego as well for sharing the outcomes of this very interesting piece of research with us today. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you in one of our upcoming ForwardKeys in France webinar. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.